Chapter 37. Emotion used intentionally. For most of a person's life, emotion is treated as either an enemy or a master. Some try to suppress it, believing that discipline requires numbness. Others surrender to it, believing that authenticity requires obedience. Both approaches misunderstand what emotion is for. Emotion is not a verdict on reality, and it is not merely an inconvenience. It is a biological signal that can be used well or used poorly. The shift that marks maturity is not the absence of feeling. It is the ability to place feeling where it belongs. This is what it means to use emotion intentionally. Intentional use begins with a simple recognition. Emotion is energy with direction. It gathers attention around something. It narrows perception toward a threat, a desire, a loss, an opportunity. It primes the body. It accelerates certain thoughts and suppresses others. When emotion is treated as law, the person becomes reactive. When emotion is treated as noise, the person becomes stiff and incomplete. When emotion is treated as energy, it becomes usable. Usable does not mean indulged. It means integrated under governance. Governance changes the timing. Most emotional interference occurs because emotion arrives at the wrong moment relative to the task. A person attempts to execute and their anxiety floods the channel. A person needs to listen and their irritation begins speaking. A person needs to decide and their fear begins predicting. The emotion itself is not the problem. It is that it occupies the center of the action. It takes the place of attention. The moment becomes organized around feeling rather than around requirement. The person then confuses emotional intensity with truth and calls their reaction insight. Intentionality restores order by sequencing. Some emotions are useful before a task. A certain tension can sharpen preparation. A sense of urgency can pull attention away from trivialities. Anticipation can energize the body. Even fear can be useful when it increases respect for risk and prompts careful planning. What makes these emotions useful is not their intensity, it is their placement. They can help you orient, they can help you gather resources, they can alert you to stakes. They are still weather, but weather can be read. The mistake is letting the weather become the driver during execution. Execution tends to demand a narrower interior. It demands contact, steadiness, the ability to perceive what is actually happening rather than what you fear might happen. Certain emotions undermine this by coloring perception. Anxiety makes you rush toward safety. Anger makes you seek victory rather than resolution. Shame makes you hide information that would help. Excitement makes you overestimate outcomes and underestimate risk. These emotions can exist while executing, but if they occupy the center, they distort. Intentional use, then, often looks like containment. Containment is not repression, it is a decision about placement. A person may feel a surge of anger during a negotiation. The anger is information about a boundary or a perceived violation. It may even be correct. Yet if the person speaks from the anger becomes the medium of communication, and the message becomes contaminated. The person loses precision. They escalate without needing to. They create consequences that have nothing to do with the original issue. Intentional use means allowing the signal to be received while delaying the discharge. The anger can be taken seriously without being obeyed. This delay is not weakness, it is command. Command over oneself allows emotion to become a tool. A tool is something you can pick up and set down. Most people cannot set down emotion. They can only ride it until it fades. Their day becomes dictated by the rise and fall of feeling. If they feel confident, they act. If they feel uncertain, they hesitate. If they feel irritated, they become sharp. If they feel low, they disengage. They call this being human. It is human, but it is not mature. It is a life without inner sequence. Emotion becomes the scheduling system. A person with emotional discipline can use emotion to serve intention rather than to replace it. This is where high performance becomes more than neutrality. Neutrality is the default that reduces drag. Intentional emotion is the occasional application of force. There are moments when emotion can make action stronger. A leader may use conviction to rally a team, not by manufacturing drama, but by letting genuine care become visible. A worker may use frustration to identify a recurring inefficiency and fix it, rather than merely tolerating it. A person may use fear to become more prepared rather than more avoidant. A person may use sadness to tell the truth about a loss rather than pretending nothing happened. These are not interruptions, they are purposeful engagements with the signal. The critical difference is that the person is choosing the use. They are not being carried. Being carried feels like momentum. It also feels like inevitability. People often talk about losing their temper as if the temper were a thief. They talk about being overwhelmed as if the day attacked them. They talk about getting in their head as if thought were an external force. These phrases reveal how powerless the person feels inside their experience. Intentional emotion is the opposite posture. It is the posture of ownership. The feeling arises, it is acknowledged, and then it is placed in relation to what must be done. This placement often requires the simplest kind of humility, admitting that the feeling is not the same as the moment. Emotion can be true in its own domain while being inaccurate as a description of reality. A person can feel rejected without being rejected. They can feel unsafe without being in danger. They can feel behind without being behind. Feelings describe inner state, not objective circumstance. When a person forgets this, emotion becomes an interruption because it begins rewriting perception. When a person remembers this, emotion can be used as data. Data can inform action without becoming action. This is especially important with the emotions people respect the least. Boredom, for example, is often treated as a sign that the work is wrong or meaningless. Boredom can also be a sign that the mind is addicted to stimulation. It can be a useful warning that attention is becoming shallow. If boredom is used intentionally, it can become a prompt to deepen contact rather than to escape. The person notices boredom and returns to precision. They re-enter the task. The boredom then changes, not because it was fought, but because attention was restored. Even anxiety can be used intentionally in this way. Anxiety often arises when there is uncertainty and perceived consequence. It is the nervous system attempting to protect. Used unintentionally, it creates avoidance, procrastination, and frantic overwork. Used intentionally, it can be a signal to clarify the next concrete action. Anxiety thrives on vague threat. It weakens when the threat is converted into specifics. The person does not try to eliminate the feeling first. They use the feeling as a reason to narrow their focus and engage the next step cleanly. Anger, too, can be used intentionally. Anger often points toward violated boundaries or accumulated resentment. Used unintentionally, it harms relationships and clouds judgment. Used intentionally, it can become the energy required to correct a pattern that has been tolerated too long. The correction does not need to be harsh. The anger can supply the spine while the mind supplies the words. The result is firmness without drama. The person does not need to be cruel to be clear. There is a quiet sophistication in being able to do this. It requires separating the signal from the discharge. Discharge is the action people take to relieve the feeling. Most reactive behavior is discharge. The person snaps, scrolls, overeats, buys, withdraws, vents, argues, reassures themselves endlessly, not because these actions solve the underlying issue, but because they momentarily reduce sensation. The nervous system is seeking relief. The mind provides a behavior. The relief reinforces the behavior. Over time, the person becomes trained to discharge rather than to use. Intentional emotion interrupts this loop. It keeps the signal intact long enough to be understood. Understanding does not mean analyzing endlessly. It means seeing the function of the feeling in relation to reality and choosing a response that serves the person's standards rather than the person's urge for immediate relief. This is why emotional discipline is not coldness. It is delayed gratification applied to inner life. It is the willingness to endure a feeling long enough to act well rather than act quickly. Acting well changes the emotional system over time. The nervous system learns that it does not need to escalate to be heard. One reason emotions become overwhelming is that they have been ignored or numbed repeatedly. The system learns that subtle signals do not produce action, so it increases intensity. A person who uses emotion intentionally tends to develop a calmer emotional profile, not because they suppress feeling, but because the system becomes confident that signals will be received. The volume does not need to be as high. The person becomes more stable, not through denial, but through responsiveness guided by standards. Standards are what make emotion a tool rather than a ruler. A tool is used in service of a craft. Craft requires selecting what belongs. Certain emotional expressions belong in certain places. There are moments where tenderness is the correct expression and moments where firmness is. There are moments where grief must be allowed space and moments where it must be carried quietly because others depend on you. These are not contradictions, they are timing, they are context. The person with mastery does not demand that every emotion be expressed immediately. They also do not demand that every emotion be hidden. They choose. Choice is the center of this chapter. Not the fantasy of constant choice, but the real choice that appears when the mind is quiet enough to notice the moment before reaction. In that moment, emotion can be held rather than discharged. It can inform rather than interrupt. It can supply energy without supplying distortion. A person can use intensity without being consumed by it. They can use passion without turning it into volatility. They can use urgency without turning their life into a continuous emergency. This is what it looks like when emotion becomes an instrument under command. The person does not need to eliminate feeling to be effective. They need to stop letting feeling steal the wheel. When emotion is used intentionally, it becomes part of mastery rather than the opponent of mastery. It becomes something that can be invited into the work when it is useful and placed aside when it is not, so that attention remains clear, action remains clean, and the person remains what they have been building toward all along. Someone who can move through life with both depth and steadiness, without making their inner weather the cost of every step.